Welcome to this panel conversation on the topic of coalition building and collaborative leadership in the public sector. My name is Erin Park-Cohn. I am the director of the Wordle Center for Leadership at Smith, and I'm also a member of the Smith College class of 2000. This evening's event is a combined effort of the Wordle Center and several other partner units on campus, including the Lazarus Center for Career Development, the Office of Alumni Relations, and the Government Department. We were inspired to pull this panel of amazing alums together as a contribution to the themed Year on Democracies, which is especially fitting given our current historical moment, and also which has really generated robust discourse within the larger Smith community about the various meanings and mechanisms of democratic societies. We're looking forward to exploring those questions with our guests. We're also excited to hear from them about their experiences with collaborative leadership and coalition building, as each of them has forged a unique career path in the public sector. I am very excited about tonight's panel because some of the very best conversations that I have ever had in my life have been with Smithies, either that when I was a student or with fellow alums since I graduated. And now that I get to work at Smith, I get to talk to present day students and continue to have excellent conversations with them. So I'm very excited to speak to our four alum panelists tonight. What's most exciting about this panel is that it includes Smith alums whose experience in public sector work varies incredibly widely. And also they're all in different phases of their career. And so I'm excited to hear them speak to each other about their varying perspectives, given where they are on their career paths. Tonight's panelists include Christina Dragon, who is a member of the class of 2009. Christina spent most of her career within the Department of Health and Human Services, working on measurement and data issues for sexual and gender minority, or SGM, populations. Christina is also proud of her work on two infectious disease public health emergencies, the Ebola response in 2015 to 2016 with the CDC, and the COVID-19 pandemic response from 2020 to 2021, you may have heard of it, while working to protect worker safety and health with OSHA. She holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and a double major from Smith College in neuroscience and women and gender studies. A native New Mexican, Christina is deeply committed to intersectional research and public health practice. The idea that populations and communities must achieve equity through data representation, and an eternal love of green chili. In her free time, she reads, runs marathons, and goes on adventures with her plot hound, Dawson, who I'm told we may hear from during our conversation. Welcome, Christina. Thanks for being here. Next, we have Kathy M., who is a member of the class of 1994 and who manages a $25 million annual portfolio at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation that is best known for supporting public media, nonprofit journalism, and documentary storytelling. During Kathy's tenure, the program has deepened and expanded its investments in the creation, dissemination, and amplification of accurate, just, and inclusive news and narratives across three areas of media: professional nonprofit reporting, nonfiction multimedia storytelling, and participatory civic media, with the goal of informing, engaging, and activating Americans to build a more equitable future. Kathy is a recognized leader in philanthropy and media. She's a member of the Board of Jurors for the Peabody Awards, a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and a former board member of Media Impact Funders, the Center for Asian American Media and Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy. Kathy earned her master's in public policy from the University of Chicago and her bachelor's in government studies from Smith. And we're very glad to have you joining us, Kathy. Next, we have Catherine Lenz, who is a member of the class of 2015 and who served as Senior Health Policy Advisor for U.S. Congressman Michael C. Burgess, MD, before beginning her new role with the Picard Group. She managed his health policy team, overseeing legislative projects and providing briefings on health policy issues. She also organized and coordinated the GOP Doctors Caucus, of which Congressman Burgess is a co-chairman. Lenz worked extensively on policy efforts involving state Medicaid infrastructure, Medicare physician payment, and pandemic preparedness and relief during Congressman Burgess's tenure as Health Subcommittee Chairman. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, she served as a liaison between the office and federal agencies. She brings a wealth of knowledge on federal health policy issues and strong relationships with several committees, including the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee. Thanks for being here, Catherine. And then last but not least, we have joining us Shirley Sagawa, who is a member of the class of 1983 and who has developed innovative social and education policy, authored groundbreaking reports, and advised national organizations and foundations on strategy over the last 3 decades of her career. She played strategic roles in the creation of America Forward, Cities of Service, Service Year Exchange, and the Presidio Institute Fellows Program, and was the founding CEO of Service Year Alliance and Foundation Executive Director of Learning First Alliance. She has served as a presidential appointee in both Democratic and Republican administrations. She served as First Lady Hillary Clinton's Deputy Chief of Staff and helped lead the startup of AmeriCorps for President Bill Clinton. For President George H.W. Bush, she served as Vice Chair of the Commission on National and Community Service. Shirley is the author of 3 books, including The American Way to Change. She holds degrees from Harvard Law School, London School of Economics, and Smith College. So welcome, Shirley. Welcome all of our panelists. I want to kick us off with the overall theme for our year at Smith, which is the Year on Democracies. And at Smith, we're really collectively exploring the many nuanced meanings of democracy as a result of that. So there's lots of different programming going on around that. And I was wondering if each of you could describe a little bit about your work in the public sector, and how has that work shaped your understanding of what it means to create and maintain a robust democratic system. And that can mean all kinds of things. And so whatever that means to you, take it in whatever direction feels right for you. And so why don't we start with Christina to answer that question first.
Thanks so much, Erin. I'm so glad to be with all of you, with all of these Smithies. It's such a joy. As a government worker, of course, I need to give my standard disclaimer that I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my own personal views, not for any of the agencies that I work for or have worked for in the past. When I think about democracy, I always am reminded of how when I was much younger, I would talk about the government and my mom would always say, "We are the government, Christina. We, the people, are the government." And I was always just so confused because I was like, yes, I know we vote and we participate and all of those things. And now that I've worked within the government, in the executive branch, in the agencies, I really do think that it is both a personal and a collective we, and all of that is based on relationships, being able to listen, being able to have effective conversations on a one-on-one basis. And that helps make all of the other larger conversations that keep democracy flowing, working smoothly. Listening and having good conversations is really at the core of democracy.
Let's move to Kathy. Tell us a little bit about how you imagine democracy playing out in the work that you've done in the public sector.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to the organizers of this event. I'm honored to be in this panel with the other Smithies. So I'm a grant maker, and the focus of my giving for the MacArthur Foundation is on journalism, which is often referred to as an essential pillar of democracy. Because among other things, journalism is meant to watch and report on the actions of our government agencies and elected officials to promote accountability and transparency, which is so important. But I want to share a problematic statistic that I think about daily, which is that in the 15 years leading up to 2020, more than 1/4 of the country's newspapers disappeared. And with them, half of all journalism jobs. So when reliable local news disappears, it's really easy for mis and disinformation to spread. It's easier for corruption to go unchecked, and it's easier and convenient for people to become cynical and apathetic about their own responsibility as citizens of a democracy. The other problem with journalism is it has often been the voice and perspective of an educated, cisgender, white, urban male. So that has for generations impacted coverage priorities, the framing and the tone of stories, often doing harm to certain communities like poor communities, rural communities, communities of color, immigrant communities, which I would argue has contributed to the fissures in our democracy and our social fabric. So for me, I think an important part of rebuilding and restoring our democracy has to include a major effort at reinventing and strengthening the American press.
Thanks, Kathy. Yes, hearing some emerging themes around conversations, who gets to join the conversation, where does that conversation happen? And so I imagine we can kind of play with some of those themes a little bit further. Catherine, what are your thoughts on how you interpret democracy and how it's played out in your work in the public sector.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Erin. I'm so happy to be here and be part of this awesome panel. But I think before working for two very different members of Congress from two very different parts of the country, you immediately go to, okay, elections, access, reliable information. From my time on the Hill and doing everything from answering phones to helping to respond to constituent mail to providing voting recommendations for my boss, I think it really comes down to remaining engaged and accessible to your constituencies, and how you can take what you learn from this advocacy and from these communities and how you can create successful policy that stands the test of time. So it is really about learning and remaining engaged and having a relationship with those that you are there to serve.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Shirley, what are your thoughts on this particular question around the meanings of democracy and what does it take to maintain a robust democratic system?
Thanks. I'm so thrilled to be here. Love being invited to talk to Smithies. I guess I've been at this the longest of anyone on the panel. I actually came to Washington in the Reagan administration through the Picker program at Smith. So I always tell people, like, every experience I've had in my career, I really can point back to that just fortuity of being able to come to Washington, and learn. And democracy is experiential. It doesn't exist if we don't participate. So I've had a chance to look at it from a variety of perspectives. I started on Capitol Hill as an intern for Senator Kennedy in the Labor Committee, and that was my first job after law school. And I went on to write legislation that then become sort of a leader of the agency that had to implement the legislation, and worked in the White House, and then as a consultant to a lot of organizations that were trying to influence policy and on a variety of boards. So I sort of look at this over a long time span and realize some things are better and some things are worse right now in terms of how democracy is functioning. When I was first in Washington, there was a lot of goodwill. I mean, you really could negotiate things across the aisle. People did try to come to agreement. There was a lot of people in the middle, and that mattered a lot. There was also a lot of lack of understanding about, for example, how important it was to really have the people at the table who are going to be experiencing the results of the policy. So there's been things that have changed. And I really feel like, for me, it is all about participation. Listening to the voices that people have intrinsically. It's not giving people a voice. Everybody has a voice. It's just that we choose not to listen to some important constituents. So that's my thought.
Part of what you all are surfacing in some ways speaks to one of the other themes that we imagine for this particular conversation, which is collaboration and coalition building. And Shirley, you just mentioned that it felt like in a previous era, perhaps, or at the beginning of your career, there was more space for reaching across the aisle, reaching across political divides to create those collaborations and coalitions. And so I'm curious if a couple of you might be willing to speak to these questions around collaboration and coalition building and their space within that understanding of democracy.
So I'll give you an example of a piece of legislation that I'm associated with, which is the national service legislation. And when we first were putting that together, I was working in the Senate. And there was a coalition outside of government that had come together, which included the People for the American Way, for the example, a group of conservation corps, youth service programs, Council of Chief State School Officers, higher ed institutions through Campus Compact. There weren't organizations that usually sat at the same tables. They often were working on different types of issues. The higher ed institutions sat at the table with other higher ed institutions and organizers. So having that diverse group of outside voices talking to a lot of people on Capitol Hill really gave some life to the whole concept of national service. And for those of you who don't know what a national service is, if you've heard of AmeriCorps or the Peace Corps, those are examples. And the bill I'm talking about was the bill that ultimately became AmeriCorps. So that gives people a chance to serve for a year or more, and in return for some benefits like money for college. The coalition outside was important, but it was equally important that within, in my case, in the Senate, where the bill was originated, we actually had people working together from very different political persuasions. So, we had Senator Kennedy, I think everybody knows his persuasion, but we also are working very closely with Senator Hatch, who was a conservative Republican, deep Mormon, and the Mormon church sends people on missions. And so he sort of understood from his own personal religious experience how important that year was. So he wanted to help us figure out how to get a bill together across big political divides. And we ended up negotiating the bill with President George H.W. Bush and his team, who also thought about service from a very different perspective. I probably more of a patrician, charitable perspective. But having all those perspectives at the table, we resulted in something that had pretty good bipartisan support and is still around to this day.
I mean, it sounds a little bit like part of what the work was figuring out what values drive each of these different parties. And then how do you have those values communicated in a way that folks feel like they're having the same conversation?
Yeah. You can't do that without being able to sit down and trust somebody and talk about what you want. And so having that level of trust and a willingness to hear other people who aren't, and just not reflexively decide he voted this way on this other bill, and so I think he's the monster and I can't listen to him on something else. That made it possible to have that synergy so that we passed so many bills when I was working in the late 80s. So I left the Senate staff in 1990. I've seen that happen in so many other contexts to this day, that it does take that hard work of just kind of going, all right, let me get to the core of what it is that you want and why. And maybe there's another way to do it that we can both agree with.
Thanks. Christina, this was a topic that also seemed to resonate with you. Do you want to share a little bit about your experience with coalition building and collaboration?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Shirley was talking about, to me, sounds like a much more macro, like large scale type of collaboration building. And most of the work that I've done in public service, we're focused on much more micro issues, whether it's a very specific program or a particular implementation of policy. We're not necessarily driving the policy. It's up to us to take whatever Congress decides and then find a way to effectively implement it. So I think really, Shirley, what you said about trust resonates so strongly with me, because throughout my federal career, really forming relationships, and I try to go into every new like interpersonal relationship just like with enthusiasm and joy, because a stranger is a friend you haven't met yet. I really do think that building those relationships, if we can talk about gardening, then when I want to approach somebody and say, hey, it seems like this other person in your office is really being a roadblock to us actually like getting this paper cleared that we need to get cleared to implement the policy that we're working on. Would you mind facilitating a conversation? They'd be like, oh yeah, we were talking about our tomato plants the other day. Of course, let me introduce you. They also like tomato plants. Finding the humanness in your co-conspirators is, I think, something that we're missing in a lot of the factiousness. Not to say that it doesn't happen. We have, I'm sure people have heard that there is a lot of siloing in government. That is absolutely true. So, really working and building those networks of people, and having been at multiple agencies throughout my career, I always make sure to maintain all of the relationships from every past place that I've been at, because you never know when you'll need to reconnect with that person for a particular thing that you're working on, to like use that goodwill as a way to keep moving projects along towards, success, towards implementation, towards better serving the American people.
I love the way that each of you spoke to that question from at different scales, and yet in some ways, those skills, those approaches, that relationship building, that trying to understand what motivates people, what drives them, it's all there at any scale, right? That's how you kind of build those relationships and create those connections. I want to shift gears with my next question just a little bit, because Smith is a historically women's college. This is the question of identity is one that's at the center of many of the conversations we have. And so, many of you hold identities that are perhaps not the dominant ones in the world in which you work or in which you have worked, whether that's identifying as a woman in a male dominated environment, or any other number of identity categories. And so I would love to hear a couple of you speak to what it's been like to lead in spaces where that's the case, and do those identities and perspectives offer specific challenges or unique advantages?
I've often been the only immigrant in a room of people talking about immigration issues, or the only Asian American in a room of white and Black Americans discussing race. The thing that bothers me lately is I'm often the only mother of children in public schools in a conversation where people are talking about the problems of urban education. And of course, earlier in my career, I was often the only person under 30 in lots of different settings. And so all of those, there are certain tensions in all of those situations. But in each of those situations, I've always had to ask myself, how and when do I insert myself into these conversations? How do I make a meaningful contribution? And sometimes it really is just best to be quiet and to listen and use the situation as a learning opportunity. But in many other cases, it was important to speak up and to offer my unique perspective, which was missing in the conversation. And when I have done that, I've never regretted those moments. Today, though, after being in this field for 20 years, I'm in a very different position. And so now I really focus on using my position to actively lift up others. I try to use my standing and reputation to draw attention to the people and the organizations that have a harder time being seen and heard, and being able to do that for others kind of feels like the reward for the hard work and the hard times that I faced on my road to this position.
I really relate to what Kathy has talked about, it being often the youngest person, the only Asian American, or the only mother in the room. I just remember feeling when I first came to Washington, I had gotten all these degrees, I think in part out of a great deal of sort of insecurity that I would be able to, pull my weight and be recognized and respected. And so I just kept going back to school, and finally it's time to start working. And the first job I got was like as a research assistant. And I had a law degree. Every other people I knew were like, pulling in a lot of money and had these much more impressive jobs. And I felt very, well, I'm just going to do the best job I can do. And after about a year, I realized I need to do something about this, because I'm being treated like I don't have the things to offer that I think I have. And it was very hard for me to advocate for myself. I'd gone through law school in a largely male law school, so I felt like I know how to do this. So I went to the woman chief of staff, not my direct boss or my boss's boss, who were men. I got a raise, and I got issues that I could handle on my own, but it was nerve-wracking for me. So, sort of fast forward through the years, when I was in the White House, I had to go to this thing called the deputies meeting. It was the deputies in each of the different offices in the White House. So like the deputy in political affairs, the deputy in speech writing, et cetera. And I was the deputy in the office of the first lady. And they held the meetings at 7 p.m. And my child was in White House daycare, and it closed at 7 p.m. So there's no way I could be at a meeting of deputies at 7 p.m. So I went to the head deputy and I said, this is why I'm not coming to the meetings. I would be happy to come at another time. And, she said, there's no reason we can't move it to 5. And they moved the meeting to 5. Be a self-advocate so that you can do the job that you're there to do.
So I'm the director of the Leadership Center at Smith. And so I'm always fascinated to hear how people understand leadership and how they frame that term. And one of the things that we work on building in students, but also folks on campus in general, is the idea that leadership doesn't always have to mean having a high status role or being in charge. And so I was wondering if a couple of you might speak to the times when you've had to lead from the middle, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you face in that position?
This is a great question. And I think something that any Hill staffer can probably identify with. It's very rare that unless you are a member of Congress or a senator, that you will be at the top of the ladder and whatever office you are in. So it's tough sometimes and hard to identify, I think, an area in which you can lead, especially as maybe a fresh LA without a ton of experience walking into a committee situation where you're surrounded by subject matter experts who have had years of experience on this specific policy and know the ins and outs. So, I think a lot of it is finding a niche and finding an area that you feel passionate about and that you would like to create some change in. And then even finding a niche within that niche, and kind of identifying maybe an area that there maybe isn't a lot of work on, or there isn't a lot of attention from various offices that there should be, and then diving into it and learning everything that you can about it and reaching out to anyone and anyone who maybe has some experience with it, whether that be other staffers or folks from the agencies or constituents, and just learning everything you can from these people. And then from these relationships and kind of build a coalition with these others. I think offering this advice to other staffers or other members who might be interested in pursuing this issue as well. And people will eventually, I think, identify you as kind of an expert or a go-to person on this specific policy or issue or area of expertise. And, a lot of it is just identifying these areas and diving head on and not being afraid to build relationships with those who are experts. But I think specifically from my time in Congress, I just started as a health LA, and I was trying to figure out areas where I could build this portfolio and areas that needed some attention and help that my boss could get involved with. And personalized medicine was one such area. And so I reached out to different patient groups and hospitals and you name it, companies that were involved with this type of medicine to see what was going on, where there might be some policy fixes. And, it's an area of medicine that's been around for a while, but it really did not receive a lot of attention from the Hill. And found out that Congressman Eric Swalwell was also very interested in this. So reached out to his legislative assistant, and we had coffee and hit it off and decided this is a great area for us to work together on. And we launched the Personalized Medicine Caucus and invited other member offices and invited guest speakers, and I've used it as a launch pad to discuss different ideas and to progress this area of policy. A lot of it is finding this area, taking initiative, but not being afraid to say, I don't know anything. Can you please just teach me what you know? And getting these different perspectives and then applying them.
That's great. It sounds like finding your own little special corner, but then create those networks. And it seems like that's great advice. Even if you're not necessarily working within that same setting, right? That I can imagine that being applicable in lots of different leading from the middle moments where it's like not knowing what's within my power, what's not. What is the thing I can carve out to make an impact on within my organization or within the space that I'm working in? Yeah.
Leading from the middle has a lot to do with finding your voice and advocating for yourself. It's definitely connected to that. And really managing up is just an essential workplace skill that we should all develop as soon as possible. But for me, I am still very much managing from the middle and leading from the middle. While I'm the head of a team and the head of a program, I do work for a larger institution, as many of us do. And I still have to convince my boss, the president, the board of directors to approve any grant recommendations that we want to make. And one of my passions is tackling the institutional tendency in philanthropy to assign credibility to people and organizations that are viewed as the best, the biggest, the longest track records, filled with people with impressive backgrounds. That's something that in our field we really grapple with. To be fair, grant makers have come a long way, especially in the past few years, regarding our understanding of how systemic racism and implicit bias reinforces privilege, and how we have to be really intentional and proactive in order to achieve meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so for me, what this means in very concrete terms, as I'm thinking about leading from the middle, is that we have to interrogate our choices as grant makers and admit that we often do end up giving money to the same organizations over and over again, while making it very difficult for new organizations and young leaders without elite backgrounds, for example, to break through. They just aren't afforded the opportunity to become the best in class because they never receive the type of sustained and significant investment others have received. So for me, this is currently my leading from the middle passion mission. And luckily, I work for an institution that's been receptive and committed to the same type of values and outcomes.
That managing up skill is one that's really hard to learn how to do. And I find that we all kind of bumble our way through it, right? And learn through making mistakes probably. And I actually just had a conversation with a recent Smith graduate who graduated last year, who came to me to ask for some advice on exactly that question of how do I share feedback with my boss? Because she had not learned that as a college student, right? Where do we learn that? For some folks, working on public policy issues can feel daunting or overwhelming or dispiriting. If that resonates with you, what has helped you to maintain your sense of hope and optimism in the work? And if it doesn't, how have you helped buoy others around you who maybe are facing that sense of like, wow, this is too big and I don't know what to do?
I think it's so easy to get bogged down by and just frankly dispirited by the politics and the negativity and lack of willingness to work with each other at times, especially I think when you are maybe not involved with the political side, but you are hyper focused on the policy and you have these great relationships with other offices and working across the aisle. And then all of a sudden something stupid happens and your efforts just kind of get crushed. Again, from a federal level, sometimes you just look at the broader picture and you sometimes get so involved with the finite details that you forget that this will have such an impact on communities and on individuals. And it kind of goes back to the coalition building and just from a personal aspect, finding a good support system and building that support system around you. And I think finding a mentor who has gone through similar experiences and can remind you of why you're there, but also kind of shepherd you through that process. And but also to provide others with that mentorship as well. And I think sometimes that refreshes your view and reminds you of, again, why you're there, seeing it from a different angle and seeing what you're working on from a different angle helps. Although you might have that ultimate goal that is this maybe wide sweeping reform and you have this grand idea, you have to get there somehow. And setting smaller goals to get there, while they might seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things, sometimes are the most significant things that you can do and will have meaningful impact.
Finding mentorship, providing mentorship, but then also taking goals and breaking them down into kind of digestible chunks, perhaps that this feels attainable versus this bigger thing that we're trying to get after.
I absolutely agree with Catherine. There's so much to really buoy yourself and your colleagues up, celebrating the small victories and recognizing all of the accomplishments. It doesn't always have to be a big win, having one conversation that went really well and helped advance some of the work. So right now, in the role that I'm in with the SGMRO, the Sexual and Gender Minority Research Office at NIH, I've been working a lot on rolling out a National Academies report that our office, along with 18 other centers and offices at the National Institutes of Health, commissioned around measuring constructs of non-binary sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And so this report has a lot of really great evidence-based recommendations in it. And I've been part of the team that is working to roll this out for federal agencies who are interested in collecting or adding sexual and gender minority data. Not everybody is 100% on board, as you might imagine. There are some people who still think, oh, that's too sensitive. We don't want to ask people about their gender identity. It's okay to have sex on a form, but sex assigned at birth will be really confusing to people. And I think it can feel so challenging, as a cisgender lesbian. It is sometimes very discouraging sharing this presentation that I'm personally invested in and professionally invested in, and having the reception from other people both not only reject the research and the science, but also reject my personal status in the world. And to that, it's only a conversation. And sometimes they've never had that conversation before. And so I think that leads back to, I get my optimism from continuing to have those conversations. If I'm the first person that is introducing this concept to folks who have been working in the federal government for however many years, and this is the first time that they've talked with somebody who identifies as a sexual minority, then, I think that's can be a really, really powerful opportunity. I really do think celebrating every small victory is like one of the things that keeps you optimistic, especially when there are so many challenges to getting anything finalized and moving forward.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's all really helpful, especially if we have students in the audience who are kind of thinking about this is the path I want to take, but there's a lot. And so how do I tackle that? And so it's great to hear your inspiring sense of how you kind of make your way through. Looking back, what is one piece of advice that you would give yourself during your early career? And so some of you might still be in your early career. You might define where you are as your early career. And I think what's cool about this panel is that you're like spread across the decades in a really awesome kind of a way. But if you had to think about advice for, newly emerging students or a younger version of you, what might that be?
I'm tempted to say over the years, I always thought things were always going to get better, but we take our democracy for granted. And I think one piece of advice would be don't. I mean, show up at everything and, do what you can, because it's fragile and we see it all around the world. And here we are experiencing some of those fraying bits that are quite frightening. Relationships really matter. It's what enables you to get work done. It enables you to learn. It greases the wheels of democracy. It makes life more fun. It makes work more fun. And so, caring about that in a way that is broad. I had an intern once, and, a lot of people are very disrespectful to interns. And then, it turned out later on, he became like the chief of staff to a member of Congress that I needed to work with. So, it's a 360 view. There's nobody above you and below you. They're just people. And it's really important that you honor that and build as many good relationships as you can.
I second everything Shirley said, but I think also just being open to learning about anything and everything and meeting people, and I think asking them how they got to where they are, what they're passionate about, why they are. I always like to tell the story, and I think Smithies in particular can really identify with this. It's, I set out, I had my plan. I knew exactly what I wanted to do, or I thought I did, and had it all mapped out. I thought I was going to do environmental and land management issues, and I am now in health policy. So talk about a 360. I was working as a legislative correspondent, and I was about to get a promotion to legislative assistant. So I'd have my own portfolio of issues, and I'd be able to really hyper focus on what I wanted to do. And part of the deal, if I got this promotion, was I would receive the health portfolio. And I was like, there is absolutely no way. I almost turned down the job because I did not want to do health policy. It was very, very frustrating the first couple of months. But when you find kind of your niche and what excites you, all of a sudden it all clicks. And here I am years later, and I'm the director of health policy now, and would not have traded any of it. But that being said, it's just so important to be open to other ideas and learning about other areas, and not necessarily, I mean, it's important to have direction, but be open to maybe other opportunities as well.
As Christina said at the very beginning, and as Shirley reiterated, I think maintaining those relationships over time is hugely important. I personally worked for a bank, when I graduated from my master's program, and then I went to work for HUD and then to MacArthur. And while each of those experiences has helped me and informed me, and I draw on that, I didn't really maintain the relationships from those places. And now when I think about it, I should have, and I regret that. And then, of course, being open-minded about the possibilities and not necessarily going in the direction that you may have anticipated. I think Catherine makes such a great point about that. Part of like the other side of that is don't dwell on your disappointment, right? If something doesn't go your way, or you don't get the job that you wanted, the promotion you wanted, a different door will open up. And it's really, you just got to pick yourself up really quick and keep moving and make the most of whatever situation that you're in. And a lot of that has to do with managing up and, all of that. So if there are, younger folks watching this panel, I think the main thing is, the career trajectory of any one person doesn't like go up in like a staircase mode. It's really like a windy path up and down. It's like a hike. And I think we have to forgive ourselves for not, Smithies are very ambitious and motivated. But so many things will happen. For maybe Shirley and I are at the stage where we've also had to take care of our elderly parents and, and children. And, you'll find yourself in that sandwich generation mode, which is very, very challenging. And managing your career, managing your family, managing your caretaking duties, all of that is just, it's hard. And so to give yourself a break and say, there's times in my career where I'm pushing down the accelerator, and there's time in my career where I'm slowing down, and it's okay.
I would echo what all of the other panelists have said. I think if there was a particular thing that I would tell my younger self, it would be to not be as afraid and anxious about pursuing new opportunities. Because even though I was at Smith and, had all of these ambitions that I wanted to embark on, I think I still really felt compelled to satisfy like the expectations of the rest of my family, of, the narratives that had been set out in front of me beforehand. And when I decided to start deviating from some of those kind of expected narratives, it was very anxiety inducing, but really I owe my entire trajectory of my career to having been able to like take the step in the next direction and allow that path to unfold and those additional relationships to lead me in other directions as my career progressed. Kathy, I hear you on all of the things. Family is always a thing that ends up influencing a lot of the time, and having that little slice of like taking care of yourself is absolutely critical to being able to show up and do our jobs well and be there for our families as well.
That's all such good advice and amazing wisdom. I want to make sure we can get a couple of questions from the audience Q&A.
So I wanted to follow the early career thread. What was your first step into your career in public service or government?
When I was a senior at Smith, I was still planning on going to med school, and I wanted to be a doctor, and I was very, very set on this being my career goal. And so I was like, well, the logical step that everybody who's planning to do med school does is go and work in a lab for 2 years. So I applied, starting probably in like early February. I started applying to labs all over the place and started interviewing as much as I possibly could. And I ended up getting an interview at a Harvard-based research lab that was based at the West Roxbury, Massachusetts VA hospital. And so our principal investigator was a professor of surgery at Harvard, but had gotten a grant and funding from the VA it was a calcium and cyclic AMP colon cancer signaling research lab. And so I, unbeknownst to me, stumbled into my first government job because the research assistant for the lab was funded by the VA. So I immediately had the first opportunity to do that. But it was not an intentional thing. I would have never found the job on USA Jobs. I found it through, I think it was an Idealist posting or something.
I mentioned earlier that it was the Picker program at Smith. And I had this notion I wanted to do something to help improve the world. And I was trying to decide between journalism and public policy, and saw the Picker program, which I think it was 6 months in Washington, and I thought that could help me figure it out. I mean, I love hearing Idealist mentioned, because when I was doing this, you went to the Nielsen and you got the directory and you found, leafed through it. And because the Senate had flipped over and the books hadn't been updated yet, I applied to who I thought was the chair of the Labor Committee, and who actually wasn't the chair of the Labor Committee. And it turned out it was May and I was supposed to start, and they called me and said, oh, by the way, Senator Williams is about to be indicted. You might want to find another internship. So Donald Robinson, the professor of government who is heading this up, said, you have to work on the Hill. You can't take any of these other jobs that you got. You must be on the Hill. And he worked it out so I could actually intern with the chair of the Labor Committee. But and as I said, that has led to every other job I've ever had. So I'm deeply grateful to him for making that happen.
I graduated and had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. And I majored in government and minored in econ. So natural progression was to go to DC. And after many, many coffees and many informational interviews, was steered into a Hill job and started out in answering the phones as a staff assistant and giving constituent tours. And I honestly thought that maybe 1-2 years of Hill experience, and then I'd kind of figure out where I wanted to go from there, and caught the bug and spent over 6 years on the Hill and just recently left. You know, it's interesting where life takes you. But again, I think it comes down to having conversations with people, learning about what their career path was and how they got there, not being afraid to jump into something, and it worked out.
Smith alums will bend over backwards to talk to you. So you have this ready-made network. You need to use it.
I have a government degree from Smith. Before I graduated, I had already gotten a fellowship to go to public policy graduate school. So I took a gap year, and actually, Shirley, I was in the White House for Hillary Clinton's speechwriter in 1995. So I don't know, maybe we crossed paths, but I had definitely planned to go, get a policy degree and go into some sort of government public service orientation. But, we talked about mentors earlier. I was assigned to a mentor during my University of Chicago period, who was the president of a foundation in Chicago. And that completely changed the trajectory of my career, because he opened all kinds of doors for me and gave me internships, which led to other internships, which led to job offers, which led to the MacArthur Foundation. And so that's where I've been. And this is sort of, the idea of being open to what doors open for you that you may not have ever imagined. I didn't even know the word philanthropy. I've spent a very long and wonderful and fun career in philanthropy is in large part due to my mentor.
If there are students joining us, if you're inspired by this conversation and you need some help focusing internship goals or exploring professional pathways, you can schedule an appointment on Handshake with a Lazarus Career Advisor, and they would be happy to talk to you about that. And for alums that are interested in additional career-related programming, keep an eye on the alum page of the Smith College website. And you can also join the Smith Business Network on LinkedIn. You can connect there to stay up to date on what's happening in the career space at Smith for alums. So much gratitude. Thank you so much. It's been lovely chatting with you this evening. And I hope everyone has a good night.